Acts 27, verse 1, while you're turning there. Last time we saw the final part of Paul's hearing before Agrippa. And it began with this verse back in Acts 26:19, whereupon, O King Agrippa, I was not disobedient unto the heavenly vision. And we talked about some of the keys to obedience to God last time. Obedience is a sign of salvation. It allows others to see who is the authority in our lives. And that should be God if we're saved. Obedience is also a characteristic of faith. It's a characteristic also of love. And Paul then tells where his help comes from. And you remember God has used multiple people to help Paul along the way. But where does he say his help comes from? God. That's it. God is the one orchestrating all of that. And you remember one of the reasons the Jews actually want to kill Paul is because he's offering salvation to the Gentiles equally, the same as to the Jews. And that's the way it is given. It's offered. It was to the Jew first, but also to the Gentile. We get saved exactly the same way any Jew would have to get saved. And so, but they didn't like that. They thought Gentiles were somehow beneath them, and that's one of the reasons. And Paul explained there during that hearing that he is only believing what all Jews claim to believe in the coming of a Messiah and the resurrection, resurrection from the dead. They just don't believe that Christ Jesus was their Messiah, and they don't believe he rose from the dead. And so that's the difference there. Festus, you remember in the middle of that, Festus is the governor. He's the one that jumps in the middle and claims that much learning has made Paul mad or crazy there. And Paul, of course, just gives a quick rebuttal to that and then goes right back to addressing Agrippa there. And so Paul knows that Agrippa knows about Jesus. And he asks him if he believes the prophets. You remember in those verses last time. Then Agrippa obviously does. He doesn't say anything. But when Paul says, I know that thou believest, remember, Agrippa doesn't say anything. He doesn't say, oh no, that's not true. He knew it. But if Agrippa believes the prophets, then he knows that Jesus is the Messiah. If he believes the prophets, he knows Jesus rose from the dead. Now, whether he will go ahead and accept him, that's the cutoff point. And you remember Agrippa says Paul has almost persuaded him to be a Christian. And Paul says, well, that's what I hope for everybody here, that you'd all be the same as I am except for the bonds. He said, I want you to be free in Christ, but I don't wish anything like imprisonment or anything like that on them. And so you remember at the end of that, Festus and Agrippa and some of those dignitaries there, they all conferred with one another. And even though they know Paul's still innocent, they pawn his appeal off on Caesar. Say, we'll just not deal with it. We'll send him on there. He appealed to Caesar, and so that's where we'll send him. And so we pick up here in Acts chapter 27. This is the first part of Paul's journey to Rome. He's going there for trial before Caesar, and they're transporting him as a prisoner of Rome. Now, we won't get through the whole account. We'll read down through about verse 25 this evening. We'll have to pick up on the rest of it maybe over the next couple of weeks. But there in verse 1, Acts 27, says, And when it was determined that we should sail into Italy, they delivered Paul and certain other prisoners unto one named Julius, a centurion of Augustus' band. And entering into a ship of Adramyttium, we launched, meaning to sail by the coast of Asia, one Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, being with us. And the next day we touched at Sidon, and Julius courteously entreated Paul and gave him liberty to go unto his friends to refresh himself. And when we had launched from thence, we sailed under Cyprus because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed over the sea of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. And there the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing into Italy, and he put us therein. And when we had sailed slowly many days, and scarce were come over against Cnidus, the wind not suffering us, we sailed under Crete over against Salmone. And hardly passing it, came unto a place which is called the Fair Havens, nigh whereunto was the city of Lasea. And now when much time was spent and when sailing was now dangerous because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them. And he said unto them, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only of the lady and the ship, but also of our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion believed the master and the owner of the ship more than those things which were spoken by Paul. And because the haven was not commodious to winter in, the more part advised to depart thence also, if by any means they might attain to Phoenice, and there to winter, which is an haven of Crete, and lieth toward the southwest and northwest. And when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, loosing thence they sailed close by Crete. But not long after there arose against it a tempestuous wind called Euroclydon. And when the ship was caught and could not bear up into the wind, we let her drive. And running under a certain island which is called Clauda, we had much work to come by the boat, which when they had taken up, they used helps, undergirding the ship, and fearing lest they should fall into the quicksands, strake sail, and so were driven. And we being exceedingly tossed with a tempest, the next day they lightened the ship. And the third day we cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship. And when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. But after long abstinence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, ye should have hearkened unto me, and not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. And now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am, and whom I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, for thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God that it shall be even as it was told me. Now, if we were honest with ourselves, most people would rather hear or read about this type of event than to have to actually go through it. This is going to be a miserable experience for them. We would probably like to avoid the storms altogether. But if we had to go through one, we would certainly want to pass through unscathed, and of course no loss, no danger of death in that, anything like that. We've already seen, though, in Paul's life, and it happens to us as well, sometimes God shielded Paul from the angry mobs. Sometimes he let them get a hold of him and beat him real good before they rescued him. Sometimes Paul gets whipped. Sometimes he didn't. Sometimes there are threats on his life. Sometimes not. And so sometimes we receive complete protection from God. Other times we go through times of testing. And God allows those too. Both of those are necessary. But honestly, we prefer the protection side. We prefer those best. But we need the other. We need to be tested. We need for God to help us grow our faith. But we can really see what we're made of, or what other people are made of, during a crisis, during that testing period. And that's evident from Paul's life. Now on this trip, Paul is a prisoner. He's been a prisoner for 2 years of Rome. Started out in Jerusalem. They moved him down to Caesarea. And so he has been a prisoner of Rome for 2 years. He has no authority on this ship. And yet, before this trip is over, he'll be the leader of the whole ship that everybody's looking to for answers. And we see there, leaders lead by example. Right? That's what commands the respect of others, not the title that they hold. It's how they lead by example. Some think that being a leader is being the boss, and that those are the same thing. Those are not the same thing. I've witnessed this numerous times from parents who were fighting with their children, trying to get them in the car, trying to get them out of the toy section at Walmart, trying to get them to do something. And they'll say this, "I'm the boss." Right? And you know by the actions They're not the boss. The child is the one doing the leading. They're just trying to appease them, trying to get them away, whatever they can do. They're not the boss there. And so we have to remember back a few chapters. If you look back at Acts 23 and verse 11, when 23:11, Acts 23:11, when Paul was first imprisoned there at Fort Antonia, that's at the Temple Mount there in Jerusalem. Fort Antonia is there on the northwest corner of that. Jesus appears to him, you remember, and cheers him up and tells him this in Acts 23:11. It says, "And the night following, the Lord stood by him and said, Be of good cheer, Paul, for as thou hast testified of me in Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also in Rome." So Jesus appeared to him there while he is under arrest at Fort Antonio and said, "You are going to Rome. You are going to share the gospel there in Rome." Now that's been 2 years before where we're at here in Acts chapter 27. But Paul knows that God is still true to His word. He didn't say it was going to happen that day, but he did say he would go there. He would make it to Rome. And so he's trusting God. Now if Paul didn't believe God at His word, this would be a lot different scenario. Paul is actually relatively calm throughout this whole series of events. This is a horrible hurricane-type storm, and yet he remains calm throughout the whole thing. When everybody else loses hope, Paul doesn't lose hope because he's believing God at His word. Now look back in Acts 27, verse 1. He says there, "And when it was determined that we should sail into Italy," of course they're going to Rome, there in Italy, "they delivered Paul and certain other prisoners unto one named Julius, a centurion of Augustus' band." Now, one note before we get too deep into this text. We notice a pronoun show up again in this verse. "And when it was determined that we should sail into Italy." When we see the "we" in the text in Acts, who do we know has joined the party now? Luke, the author. When he says he or they, he's separate from them. When he says we, he's with them again there. And so we saw that. Remember when Paul shows up in Jerusalem back in Acts chapter 21 with the love offering for the poor Jewish saints there. Luke is with them in Acts 21:17. It says, "And when we were come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly." And then Paul meets with James and the other leaders of the Jerusalem church there. And Luke kind of conspicuously is missing for a time. He kind of disappears, and he says he and they and those type of things. And now he's back. And if you look ahead to verse 2, there you see another man by the name of Aristarchus. Now that's one of the saints from the church at Thessalonica. Back in Acts 19, verse 29, Aristarchus had traveled with Paul to Ephesus in Acts 19. He was one of the men that they drug into the theater there because they couldn't find Paul. In Acts 19:29, he says, "And the whole city was filled with confusion, and having caught Gaius and Aristarchus, men of Macedonia, Paul's companions in travel, they rushed with one accord into the theater." So they couldn't find Paul, and they said, "Well, these guys are traveling with him. We'll drag them in there." And they were going to, of course, do him some harm there. That was the intent. He's also, if you look ahead, Acts 20, verse 4, he's one of the 2 representatives from the Thessalonican church that accompanied Paul back to Jerusalem to deliver the love offering. He says, "And there accompanied him into Asia Sopater of Berea, and of the Thessalonians Aristarchus, and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timotheus, and of Asia Tychicus and Trophimus." And so he's been with Paul on multiple occasions there, Aristarchus has. And so now Paul has Luke and Aristarchus, 2 dear Christian friends, with him on the journey from Caesarea to Rome. They are not prisoners of Rome. Luke and Aristarchus are not prisoners, right? Which means if they're going to travel from Caesarea to Rome, who has to pay for that? They do. They do. There. And so It's not a pleasure cruise. This is a ship. Now, shipmasters would rent out space on their vessels. Sometimes they would use that for cargo. Sometimes they would use that for passengers. Sometimes it was some cargo, some passengers. And we've already seen that when they came to Jerusalem in Acts 21:2. He says, and finding a ship sailing over unto Phoenicia, we went aboard and set forth. So they found a ship that was going that direction, going to the shore there of Palestine, to Phoenicia. And so they got on. In the next verse, we see it was carrying cargo too. Verse 3 of Acts 21, he says, now when we had discovered Cyprus, we left it on the left hand and sailed into Syria and landed at Tyre. For there the ship was to unlade her burden. So it was carrying some kind of cargo that it was going to unload there. And so that's where they landed. But we see from Luke and Aristarchus here that a good spiritual leader not only has people that will follow him, but has people who love him. And they're doing this at their own expense just to be with him, just to care for him on this trip. And so Paul is in a group of prisoners, and they are under the care of one man is the head of that. His name is Julius, and he's a centurion. A centurion is a Roman official there that's over 100 men. That's where the name comes from. Now, some of those prisoners here that are on the boat with Paul and the other passengers there, they have probably exercised the same right as a Roman citizen that Paul has. Right? You remember a Roman citizen at any time during any trial could appeal to Caesar. And that ends it. They automatically go from there to Caesar. And so if they think they're not getting their way or something's going wrong with the trial or they're not getting justice or they think they can get out of it somehow, if they were guilty and they've been convicted and they think they can get out of it, they'll appeal to Caesar and maybe hope for some mercy there. But when we see this other prisoners on this ship, we probably would assume that most, if not all of them, are what? Guilty. Guilty. Paul, on the other hand, is still innocent. Been proven now how many times? 5 times. 4 official trials and 1 hearing with Agrippa. 5 times they've proven him innocent. And so this centurion, Justus, is from Augustus' band. Now Augustus, as we talked about before, that's a title. That's not an official name. That's a title for the Caesar there. And Nero took that title also. He's the Caesar now. And so that's who they're talking about. But Julius, he was a part of an elite group of men. And those soldiers there from Augustus' band, they were originally called frumentarii. Now, frumentarii actually means the men of the grain. And they got that title because they originally guarded the transport of food to Roman troops scattered across the empire, which was mostly grain. And so they were the men of the grain. They were guarding that. That was a very important task. Roman soldiers couldn't serve, couldn't fight, couldn't defend if they can't what? Eat. And so it was important to be able to get food to them. And they didn't want the enemy to intercept those and maybe steal it, something along. And so they sent these men, and they were an elite group. They later become spies. They also became personal guards when they were transporting important people or prisoners, and that's what we see here with this group. They're transporting some prisoners to and from Rome, here in this case going to Rome, and so that's what's going on. Now when they send Paul to Rome, you remember when they sent Paul from Jerusalem to Caesarea, how many soldiers did they send with him? 470. 470. Now, we know there are not 470 here because a centurion only has how many people under his command? 100. And I'm guessing that they didn't even send all 100 with him for this trip either. But we know later on, when they change ships, now we don't know how many people are on this ship. This is a smaller ship that they start out with. They will get on a bigger ship. Now, the bigger ship will have 276 people on it. We'll know that from the shipwreck at the end. But there are less at this time. Now, look at Acts 27:2. He says, "And entering into a ship of Adramyttium, we launched, meaning to sail by the coast of Asia, one Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, being with us." Now, the ship is going, I got a map here, that's why I put the projector down. And I know we had this with the missionary journeys, but I pulled this one out, and so it's just got this trip on it there. Now, the ship is going to sail to the coast of Asia. Now, Asia Minor, that's this area right in here. So it's going from Sidon, Caesarea, up to Sidon, and they're going to sail this direction. Now, I know the line doesn't go this direction. It goes up above that. There's a reason for that. This is the direction they want to go. This is the easiest trip for them most of the time. He says in verse 3 there of Acts 27, "The next day we touched at Sidon, and Julius courteously entreated Paul and gave him liberty to go unto his friends to refresh himself." Now, Sidon is still along the coast there. This is in the region. Tyre and Sidon would be in the region we know as Phoenicia. It's just about 70 miles up the coast there from Caesarea, right? And Paul is allowed to go to his friends. He's allowed to leave port, leave the guards, leave the centurion there, and go to his friends. Now, it's nothing for Luke and Aristarchus to be able to go visit those people. They're not prisoners. They're paying passengers on this trip. But it's a big deal for the centurion to let Paul go visit his friends. Right? He's responsible for Paul. If a prisoner escaped, the soldier responsible for them took their place. So if that prisoner were going to be executed, what did they do to the soldier? They executed him. If they were going to be beaten, what did they do? They had to take the beating. Whatever the penalty was, if you lost a prisoner, you suffered that. And so Paul already has 2 friends with him, and he's going to meet some other friends there in Sidon. What if he tries to run? Right? Now, he's not the only prisoner on this ship. Right? And so they're responsible for all of them, and they even though they don't have any valid charges against him, if he runs, they won't be able to get him very easily. They won't be able to. Now, Paul's been a prisoner for 2 years. He's had 5 trials. No valid accusations, no valid charges against him. He's been proven innocent on every charge. He has been given as much liberty as a prisoner could possibly hope for. He can have people come and go anytime he wants. He just can't leave when he was at Caesarea. And so, but even though he's been illegally detained by the Roman authorities, how many times has Paul tried to escape? None. 2 years' time. They've drugged this out, and he's not tried to escape once. Now, Paul wants to go to Rome. He expressed that multiple times, and he wanted to go to Spain after that. Now, we know God cut that short, took him to glory. He didn't get to Spain. But he wants to go to Rome, right? And so, but he's allowing it to happen in God's timing. If he tries to run, if he escapes, if Julius lets him go to his friends there in Sidon and they take off and run and say, let's just go. Let's just run. I haven't done anything wrong anyway, right? Can he go to Rome after that? He could. That'd be the dumbest thing ever. Right? If you're an escaped prisoner from the Roman government, why would you show up in Rome? If you want to die, that's where you'd go. Because even though he's innocent, if he escapes as a prisoner and they catch him again, they'll kill him then. And so he certainly wouldn't want to take that chance of going to Rome. Right? And so escape really isn't an option for Paul. He's going to let God take him there. There in that verse, you also see that term refresh. Let him refresh himself. That's a medical term, by the way. Paul is probably having a flare-up. We know he has a thorn in the flesh. We know he had some physical problems, sickness, things along the way. I personally believe maybe that was malaria, because it does have flare-ups and it does affect vision, and we know Paul had vision problems, but that's beside the point. But he is getting some medical attention from his friends, including his onboard physician. You remember what Luke's occupation is? He's a doctor, he's a physician, and so they're going to get him some treatment. Verse 4, he says, "And when we had launched from thence, we sailed under Cyprus, because the winds were contrary." Now, I know if you're looking at this map, you're saying, well, they didn't go under Cyprus, they went over Cyprus. That's just how we think about things. Now, what's going on here is the under doesn't mean south. They're using the island as a shield. The winds are coming from the west. They're going that direction, right, toward the east. Right? And so when they sail behind, we'd say behind Cyprus instead of under Cyprus. They're sailing behind that, and then that island will do what with those winds? It'll shield them to some degree. It's kind of like a block for them. And so they can't sail the direction they want to go. This direction is just too hard to go directly against the wind. So they say, well, we'll go up this way. Maybe the winds will die down by the time they get across the top. And so verse 5, "And when we had sailed over the sea of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia." And we see Cilicia, that's the water there. Pamphylia there, and they came to Myra in the province of Lycia there. Now, historically, we know Festus took office as governor in Judea in the month of July. So this is sometime around mid-August when they actually send him. By the time he goes through those trials, you remember he spent the 10 days in Jerusalem, a few days in Caesarea, 10 days in Jerusalem, back for the trials. He's had Agrippa over for the trials. So by the time they've got through all of that, it's about mid-August when they actually leave for Rome. Now, nobody, and I mean nobody, tried to cross the Mediterranean Sea from November 11th until the end of March. Right? Nobody did that. Right? Do you know why nobody did that? That's a death sentence. The ships would not sustain the weather that they have at that time of year. And so these ships are not what we see today. They're much more crude, and so nobody tried to travel that direction on the Mediterranean from November 11th to the end of March. Now, if you back up a couple of months, from September 14th to November 11th, that 2-month period of time there, that's a gamble. Right? It's kind of like this time of year for us. We had 70-something degrees last week, and then what we have Monday? Snow flurries. And, it's a gamble. We don't know what we're going to get. That's the same thing from September 14th to November 11th. They don't know what they're going to get. They could get some really good sailing during that time. They could get some storms, and it could be ugly too. And so some would take that chance, but it's a dangerous time. Now, Myra is the southernmost point of Asia Minor there. It's the chief port. A lot of Egyptian vessels come there. Now here's Egypt way down here. You see Alexandria there is the port. Egypt supplies a lot of the Roman Empire with grain. And so they have these ships that travel out of Alexandria there. And so we see there in Acts 27:6, "And there the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing into Italy, and he put us therein." So when they get to Myra here, they find one of these ships that's coming up here, and then it's going over to Italy with grain. It's one of those grain transport ships, and they've got room, and so the centurion transfers them and the prisoners over to that ship. It's a bigger ship. Now there are 276 men on board. From Sidon to Myra took them 9 days. Right. So they're at the end of August now. End of August. Look at verse 7. He says, "And when we had sailed slowly many days and scarce were come over against Cnidus, the wind not suffering us, we sailed under Crete over against Salmone. And so they're traveling against the winds. Like I said, they're coming from the west. They're trying to go this direction, trying to go that direction, but they're going against the wind. And so the wind won't let them go that direction very fast. You zigzag is how they do it. And it's very slow. And normally they would have taken port here at Cnidus. But when they get right up there to it, the winds are fighting them, and they can't even make port there. And so they do the same thing that they did with Cyprus here, with Crete. They sail under it, which means behind it. And you see they're going the opposite direction now. They are going to go technically what we call under it, but they're going behind it to try to shield against the wind. Now look at verse 8. He says, "And hardly passing it, came into a place which is called the Fair Havens, nigh whereunto was the city of Lasea." Now they're trying to get past the island of Crete, but they can only get about halfway there, and they land in this place called Fair Havens. Now don't let the name fool you. That's just a port, and not a good one. It's not a good place to stay. They're certainly not a place they want to try to keep 276 people for 4.5 months in the winter season. And of course, if they have to stay there, they're going to have to pay the crew the whole time that they're there. Right? And so verse 9 says, "Now when much time was spent and when sailing was now dangerous because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them." So they stayed too long. They're trying to get wind that'll take them the right direction, but just something that they can go on and make a run for it. They aren't in the death zone. They're not in the November 11 to March area. But they did move into the dangerous, unpredictable area. That's what he says when sailing was now dangerous. They're past that September 14th point there. And it says the fast was not already past. Now the fast was a traditional fast for the Jews. For Yom Kippur, we know that is the Day of Atonement. And that happens between the end of September and the beginning of October. In 59 AD, which is when we believe this to be, that would have happened on October 5th. So we know they're in that September to November range. If this happened, the fast is passed after October 5th. Right? This is mid-October. So they had left here at Caesarea in mid-August. They've gone 2 months, and they're not even halfway to Rome. It's bad. It's bad there. And so verse 10 there, he says, "And said unto them, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only of the lading and ship, but also of our lives." And so Paul warns them here, don't try to leave the Fair Havens. Don't try to leave. It's going to be violent. It's going to be destructive if they try to leave. And it's really an act of love from Paul. Now, how do we know that? How do we know this is an act of love from Paul? Well, first of all, what investment does Paul have in this ship? None. He doesn't have anything in this ship. None of this cargo belongs to him. He's not going to profit if this ship makes it or it doesn't make it. Right? Secondly, right, even if all the rest of the 275 people on board drowned in the Mediterranean Sea, who is guaranteed to make it to Rome? Paul is. Jesus has already told him, you're going to go to Rome. You're going to testify of me. And so who is he looking out for here? He's caring for everybody else. It's nothing that he's going to do. Right? We know Paul has already been through 3 other shipwrecks. In 2 Corinthians 11:25, he says, "Thrice was I beaten with rods, once I was stoned, thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day I have been in the deep." Now, he wrote that in 56 AD. This is 59 AD, 3 years later. So we know he'd already been in 3 shipwrecks. Right? Shipwrecks are kind of like car wrecks. If you've ever been in one, you don't want to be in another one. I don't care if it's a little fender bender or if somebody T-bones you on the highway. If you've been in one, you don't want to be in another one. And that's the way shipwrecks are. Right? You know, he's going to survive this thing because God's already promised him, but it's still something you don't really want to have to go through. But that's another characteristic. Good leaders care about other people, and he's trying to care for them here. Look at verse 11. Nevertheless, the centurion believed the master and the owner of the ship more than those things which were spoken by Paul. Now, the master in this ship here, that's the word kubernetes, which is a helmsman. He's the one steering the ship. He's the pilot. That's that title. That's the master there. The owner is the word nakleros, which is the captain. Now that's the person who is directing the orders of the ship. Now, sometimes the captain was the owner of the ship, in addition to being in charge. And so you've got the pilot and the captain saying one thing, and Paul, the tent maker, saying something else. Now, which one are you going to take sailing advice from? You'd probably take it from the pilot and the captain. They've had the more experience. They know more of that. Now, that doesn't mean Paul's information is wrong. I can tell you by this example. I'm not rich. I don't have money. I don't. But when I say that a child of God that doesn't tithe and give faithfully, God can't bless them. That's more sound financial advice than you'll get from anybody in the world. I don't care how much money they have. That God will bless us more with a little than to have the riches. And so, the idea is, it won't hurt me if you don't tithe. It won't. That's the same thing with Paul. It won't hurt him if they don't listen to him. But he's trying to help them. Right? That's why we preach about tithing and giving. It's for your benefit. I already know the benefits of it. But here in Acts 27:12, he says, and because the haven was not commodious to winter in, the more part advised to depart thence also, if by any means they might attain to Phoenice, and there to winter, which is a haven of Crete, and lieth toward the southwest and northwest. And so the others chime in too and say, I think we ought to listen to the pilot and the captain and try at least to get to this port, Phoenix. Now, Fairhavens is a miserable place to try to stay in. But they said, well, if we can get here, that'll at least be better. In verse 13, he says, and when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, loosing thence, they sailed close by Crete. Now, the wind had been traveling from the west, fighting against them. And now it's pushing from the south. It's real soft and real gentle. And they said, oh, we can just ease right up the coast. It's going to push us up to the north. We can just steer a little left and let it keep pushing us that direction. And we can at least get to that point. Now look at verse 14. He says, but not long after there arose against it a tempestuous wind called Euroclydon. Now, Euroclydon is a sailor's term. It's a northeast wind. The wind was blowing gently from the south. Now it's blowing from the northeast. It's forcing them this direction. They want to go northwest. This wind is pushing them southwest. The wrong direction there. And Euroclydon is the most feared storm that a sailor could face. It's a hurricane or a typhoon. That's the kind of storm it is. If a sailor survived Euroclydon, they never wanted to do that again. Kind of like if you've ever been in a hurricane or a tornado, or we don't even have any tornadoes around here. Little small things, nothing like in the Midwest. But if you've ever been through one, you don't want to go through another one. And so they know this by rumor. Verse 15, he says, that when the ship was caught and could not bear up into the wind, we let her drive. So this wind from the northeast is forcing the ship the opposite direction that it wants to go. It's so strong and so violent, they can't fight it any longer. They can't even get here to Phoenix, and it drives them that direction there. Now look at verse 16. They come to a small island just offshore there from Crete called Clauda. He says, and running under a certain island which is called Clauda, we had much work to come by the boat, which when they had taken up, they used helps undergirding the ship, and fearing lest they should have fallen into the quicksands, strake sail, and so were driven. Now Clauda is a tiny island right there, just a dot And it's the same idea there. It says they're running under a certain island. They're trying to get behind it from the direction of the wind. Get a little relief from the storm there and some shelter. And they're trying to reinforce the boat and the ship here. Now the ship, the word for ship here, that's what's carrying the cargo and the people. That's the big boat. Right? Now the boat there in verse 16 is what we would call a dinghy or a lifeboat or a shore boat. Right? And so it's a small vessel. When they dock this big ship somewhere that's holding 276 people plus the cargo, those type of things, when they dock it somewhere, they dock it in the bay. Then they take the dinghy and let the dinghy down, get in it, and go to shore. You don't take this big boat to the shore. It's not like in some of those places where they got cruise ships, and the cruise ship can just pull right up there to the dock, because it's really deep. That's not what happened. They didn't have those kind of ports here in Bible times. The big boat had to stay out in the water, and the little boat's what transferred the stuff back and forth to the ship, and those kind of things. And so this dinghy or skiff or lifeboat, it would normally be pulled behind the ship. They just tied it back there with a rope and just kind of let it fall along there. But when they get caught in a storm, it gets beat around a lot and it takes on a lot of water. Now, what happens is it's putting a lot of strain then on that little rope that they're pulling it with. Now, if they lose that thing, what's going to happen? They're going to have to swim to shore from then on. Try to find another one somewhere else. And so it's a big deal for them to lose that. And so it's taken on so much water, and when it says there they had much work to come by the boat, that means they got to get that thing in, get it emptied, get it out of the water before they lose this thing in this hurricane type storm there. And so then they used helps, which are ropes or cables, right? And they're undergirding the ship. Now what they're doing is they're actually wrapping the hull. Right? They wrap the hull around the outside. After they get this dinghy up into the boat or up on the side of it, they wrap it with these ropes or cables there, basically trying to cinch it together from the outside. Now you imagine this great big boat that holds 276 people, all this grain, all that, but it only has one mast. Right? There were ships later on that had 2 or 3 masts. Right? When you've got 2 or 3 masts, it distributes the stress put on the ship in 2 or 3 different places. When you've only got one mast, it puts all the strain right there where that joins the boat. Now you imagine that thing's caught in a hurricane and it is whipping it every which way. You've seen trees in storms and stuff, how the top of them and how it will flex. Now imagine the strain it's putting on that boat, right? It's basically trying to rip the ship apart. And so they're putting this undergirding, or frapping is what we call it today. They're trying to hold that thing together so the mast doesn't rip the ship apart. That's what they're trying to do. And so when they do that there, they're trying to just keep it together. They didn't have bolts and those kind of things to attach ships, so it's a mortise and tendon joint. It's a hole and a slot, and then they put tar and pitch, things like that, to waterproof it. And so if those things start coming back apart, they don't have any way of getting it back together. They were glued. Right? And so there in verse 17 it says they feared the quicksands. Now normally we associate quicksand with something on land. Right? I always think of Gilligan's Island or Indiana Jones or something, where they get caught in the quicksand and they're just, the more they fight, that's not this. Right? This word is actually surtus, which is a shoal or a reef or a sandbar there. It's located up here on the northern shore of Africa. We see it here, Syrtis Major. And so there's this reef, there's this shoal in that area. They know they've been heading that direction. They don't want to hit that. If they hit that, it'll definitely tear the boat apart and they'll sink. And so it's a graveyard. There's a whole lot of ships that died right there in Syrtis Major there on that reef. And so they do use the sail a little bit, right, even though it isn't ideal, but they're still moving. And in verse 18 he says, "And we being exceedingly tossed with the tempest, the next day they lighten the ship." Now if a ship's lower in the water, what happens in a storm? The waves come over. You can't just turn on a bilge pump in this kind of boat. If the water comes in, how does it get back out? You got to bucket it. You got to bail it out. My dad sunk a boat nearly on Lake Erie one time, and the bilge pump had gone out, and before they knew it, it was coming up over the floor, and next thing you know, it's getting deeper and deeper and deeper, and they're taking styrofoam coolers and bailing out the boat, trying to keep that thing afloat. And by the grace of God, he survived, but they were out of land shot. They were out of land shot, and it was bad. But they're trying to get this thing higher in the water because it's taking on too much water in this storm. The only way to get that is to lighten it, and so they have to get rid of some of the cargo. And that's what they did, right? And that's their prophets there. You notice there in that verse he says, they lightened the ship. Now who's that? The ones that own the cargo. That's the crew. That's the shipmaster. That's those people. Verse 19 he says, "And the third day we cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship." On the third day we all got involved, Luke says. We were all pitching stuff overboard. That's tackling, furniture, anything that they could get rid of. Verse 20 and 21, "And when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. But after long abstinence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, you should have hearkened unto me, and not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss." So the storm's not letting up. They're caught in it. They've lost all hope. The man's wisdom has failed. They all think they're going to die at this point. They're out of options. And that's when God steps in. Paul gives them that little reminder. He says, "You remember when I warned you not to do that?" Right? But he doesn't gloat on it. He just goes right on. 22 and 23, or 22 through 25. He says, "And now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, for thou must be brought before Caesar. And lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God that it shall be even as it was told me." So Paul says, cheer up. Nobody's going to die, but we're going to lose our ride. Right? We are going to lose our ship. Right? It's one thing for Paul to know that he's not dying, but God tells him, oh no, everybody's going to make it out of this one. All 276. Now they can't see an island now. They're here. They're here. They can't see anything. They're still in this storm. There's no visibility. They can't see the stars. They can't see the sun in the daytime. They don't even know which direction they're going. They're lost at sea, like the minnow. I don't know why I got stuck on Gilligan's Island. But, as far as we can tell, Paul says they're going to live, though. They're all going to live. Now, there's no land around. There's no idea that they are going to get to land. But if it does happen, what will they know about Paul's God at the end of this? That he's real. That he's true. Right? Now, as far as we can tell, there are only a few saved people on this ship. That's Paul, Luke, and Aristarchus. But all the ungodly on board are going to be given the same protection for the sake of those three. Now, we see that all over Scripture. I just want to look at a few of these and then we'll close. We'll get the rest of it next week, Lord willing. But Genesis 18 is one example. You remember God was going to destroy Sodom. And Abraham's trying to intercede because his nephew Lot lives in Sodom. You remember that story in Genesis 18:23? He says, "And Abraham drew near and said, Wilt thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Peradventure there be 50 righteous within the city. Wilt thou also destroy and not spare the place for 50 righteous that are therein?" You remember what God says? Oh no, I wouldn't destroy it if there were 50 righteous there. Right? You remember how that goes. He keeps going down and down and down, and finally he gets to the bottom, and God says, I wouldn't destroy it for 10 righteous. And yet what did God do to Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plain? There wasn't 10 righteous people there. If there had been 10 righteous, He would have spared them for their sake. Jacob, Genesis 30:27. We'll get to Joseph in a minute, but you remember Jacob was working for his father-in-law as a dowry for his bride. It was supposed to have been one, but you remember he ends up with two, Rachel and Leah. But in Genesis 30:27, and Laban said unto him, I pray thee, if I have found favor in thine eyes, tarry, for I have learned by experience that the Lord hath blessed me for thy sake. He's no fool. He knows because God is blessing Jacob, that's pouring over on him. In Genesis 39, that's the last one we'll look at, the one with Joseph. You remember Joseph had been sold into slavery, Genesis 39, verse 5. It says, and it came to pass from the time that he had made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. And then you see again, when of course Potiphar's wife makes a pass at him and he ends up in prison, you see the same thing when he's in Pharaoh's prison. Genesis 39:23. It says, the keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him. And that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. And so he was even blessing the things that were going on in the prison for Joseph's sake. I believe God has blessed America tremendously for the sake of the righteous. But the problem is, the number of righteous is doing what? It's going down. Now, I believe America's heading for judgment. I don't know how few of the righteous there will be that God can still bless our country. But it can't last forever. It can't. And so next time we'll see the rest of the shipwreck. Any questions or comments though for this evening?